Welcome everyone, this is Honest Restart. In this video, we're going to be talking about the massive potential for the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. For now, we're just calling it Breath of the Wild 2. This game, I think, is going to be absolutely incredible when it finally comes out. And I've been talking about for quite some time how I hope it comes out holiday 2020, but of course, we don't know when it's actually coming out. But really, I just want it to come out as soon as possible for how excited I am for this game. I think it could be a real game changer here. Breath of the Wild 1, in my opinion, is one of the greatest games of all time. When it comes to Metacritic scores, it's one of the highest reviewed games in years. When it comes to sales for Zelda games, it is the highest selling Zelda game ever. And when you consider what this game did and how it sort of changed how we've looked at open world games ever since, it's a very, very special game. When it comes to capturing that sense of adventure, I don't think there's any game that does any better. And for me, adventure, exploring these other worlds and escaping into them, is the most interesting and important aspect to video games. And when I consider everything that was great about Breath of the Wild and how it can be improved upon, I have to imagine that Breath of the Wild 2 could be something even more special, something that would completely exceed Breath of the Wild 1, which may seem crazy, but consider this. The original Breath of the Wild was Nintendo's first real attempt at the open-air format for Zelda games. That was their first attempt. With their second attempt, I think they can master it, and they could perfect the formula that they used in Breath of the Wild 1, and that could include so many different things which we're going to be talking about in this video, and that's why I think Breath of the Wild 2 has a massive amount of potential. It could very well be one of, if not the greatest game of all time. If Breath of the Wild 1 is already in that conversation, if Breath of the Wild 2 manages to perfect a lot of the things that were established in Breath of the Wild 1, and then some, I think we have a serious contender here. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now before we jump into things, I want to quickly talk about my social media. There is a Twitter page, a Discord community, a Patreon page, and a Twitch channel. If you are interested in any of that, please check it all out. It is linked in the description below. Now, the reason I decided to talk about this now is because, one, well, I just want to talk more about Zelda, of course, but also we've been getting some rumors as of late that I find to be very interesting. There's this rumor about how there's going to be another form of the Guardian from Breath of the Wild, except this one, instead of being based off Sheikah technology, it's going to be based off their counterparts, the Yiga technology. So, an evil Guardian, and I don't mean a Guardian consumed by the malice of Ganon, but actually a Guardian designed initially to be evil. And there's also this talk of there being an easy mode in the game, or rather, a mode in the game where the durability system will be far more forgiving for those who are not a fan of it. You know, when weapons break very easily after only a few different hits. In this mode, well, weapons will take a lot more damage before they would actually break. So considering how that was a very common complaint for Breath of the Wild, I could definitely see how a mode like that can make this game even more accessible and enjoyable for an even larger audience. But another common critique for Breath of the Wild was the way the story was done. Well, I personally believe that if you look at all the characters and the flashbacks, there's a very good story there. The manner in which it was told was not ideal. So I think Nintendo struggled a little bit with telling us a very strong story, but also fitting it into an open world format where you can do whatever you want, whenever you please. So there's this other rumor going around that when you start Breath of the Wild 2, it's going to have more of a narrative focus in the beginning, a more linear narrative focus. We've seen the trailer, it does seem to be more of a story trailer, and it would appear that the awakening of Ganondorf is what sets everything else into motion, and what the rumor speaks of is that Ganondorf uses his malice to block off most of Hyrule, and you go from one province to another, slowly unlocking the world, eventually getting to a point where you have a world that's even bigger and denser than the original Breath of the Wild, and you were rewarded for progressing through this linear story by going one region to another, breaking down the malice, and having an even better, denser, open-air version of Breath of the Wild. All these rumors are very exciting, and they could be true, but we don't know for sure until we actually see the game, of course. But regardless of the rumors, based on what we got for Breath of the Wild 1, and how the Zelda team has changed from game to game over the years, there are certain things I'm expecting to change with Breath of the Wild 2, and it's for those reasons that I'm so confident that this game is going to be one of the greatest games ever made. So I've already brought up some criticisms for Breath of the Wild 1 in relation to these rumors, and I do think there's a lot of reason to believe, despite the rumors, that Nintendo will be addressing these criticisms, because when you take a look at the different Zelda games that have come out over the years, especially the 3D ones, it does seem that the Zelda team has been reactive to the biggest complaints for those particular games. Let's take a look at The Wind Waker. The Wind Waker is an amazing game, sure, but when that game released, there was a lot of criticism for the game because of its aesthetic and overall art design. People wanted a more realistic Zelda, not a toon Zelda, and that demand greatly influenced the art design for the very next Zelda game, Twilight Princess, which arguably is one of the most darker, most realistic Zeldas we've ever seen. However, with Twilight Princess, the designs were even more over the top, more ambitious, and more epic than ever before. But with these epic boss designs, there was a little bit of disappointment in terms of how easy they were to defeat. So that was a common criticism for Twilight Princess. So what happened? Nintendo went ahead and made the most difficult 3D Zelda yet with Skyward Sword. Not only was the game far more challenging in its normal mode, but there was also a hero mode that we had not seen beforehand. And yet, a big criticism amongst Zelda fans for Skyward Sword was that the game was far too linear. So what happened? The next big 3D Zelda was Breath of the Wild, the most open Zelda game of all time. The overall point I'm trying to make here is that the Zelda team does respond to the criticisms of Zelda fans, and they are reactive with the next games that come out. So then, let's take a look at some of the criticisms of Breath of the Wild 1. Now, I'm about to talk about things that I think could be better about Breath of the Wild, but that's not to say I don't think the game is amazing. Do not get me wrong, I think Breath of the Wild is one of the greatest games of all time. It has changed the way I perceive open world games moving forward. But that doesn't mean it's perfect. There is no such thing as perfection. With every game, there is always room for improvement. So I'm going to be talking about some common criticisms for Breath of the Wild 1 and how they may be improved upon in Breath of the Wild 2. So a very common complaint amongst many people for Breath of the Wild 1 was the durability of the weapons in the game. A lot of people didn't like it very much. It made us sort of hoard our weapons and not want to use them in fear of them breaking. And while I think once you get past that mental hurdle of not preserving your weapons, there's a certain beauty and flow to breaking down a weapon, using it as a critical hit, finding other weapons around you, and simply sort of using your environment as you progress throughout the game. I think that's very interesting, and the durability system definitely adds to that, but I definitely think there are things that can be adjusted upon when it comes to the overall battle system, which does include the durability of weapons. Now, we did bring up earlier how there is this rumor that there may be another mode, an easy mode, that makes weapons more durable. That's certainly one way they can maybe address how durability is handled, but another way it can maybe be handled is by tweaking that durability a little bit, where weapons can last a little bit longer, or when they break, if it's a special weapon you want to preserve, maybe you could find the fragments and repair them later on. We didn't have a way to repair or craft weapons in Breath of the Wild. It would be great to see that in the sequel. And since we're on the subject of the battle system, even though this wasn't one of the criticisms I had in mind, I definitely think they should improve upon the different battle mechanics they had in Breath of the Wild 1. Simply in terms of the amount of moves you had available to you when using a sword, or a lance, or a hammer, things of that nature. I think they could expand upon it. If you take the battle mechanics for Twilight Princess, there's a lot more you could do with just a sword. Of course, all you had was just a sword, so there's more work to be done there, but imagine if they had a similar amount of battle mechanics for the sword in Breath of the Wild, but also they expanded that to more options for the lance, or the hammer, or the spear, or the bow. If they gave us more things to do in that way, I think they could definitely add more variety to the combat and make things even more interesting. Now, I'm not necessarily expecting 7 new killer moves for every different weapon type in Breath of the Wild 2, but to add a few more moves for the different weapon types I think is something they could at least do, and that would definitely make things a little bit better. With this improved battle system, it would be really great to take advantage of it against even more types of enemies and monsters. You see, in Breath of the Wild 1, another common criticism for the game was that there wasn't too much variety in the enemy design. Compared to previous Zelda games, there just weren't that many designs for the different enemies in the game. Really, there were just different colors for a few particular enemies. Since this is going to be Breath of the Wild 2, and they're going to be reusing a lot of different assets like going back to the world, they will have more of an opportunity to add even more enemy types into the game and expand upon the ones that are already there. And what we're going to end up getting is a lot more variety with the enemies, which of course will be very exciting, but I'm not just talking about the common enemies, but also overworld bosses as well. Seeing more different types of overworld bosses will be very interesting to see. I was always a little disappointed that there wasn't a special overworld boss in the ocean. There was one in the desert and the field, but there wasn't one in the ocean. And while we're at it, why don't we get some more for the sky as well? I am thinking that in the sequel, since they are going to be going back to Hyrule, they're going to have to add a lot more within Hyrule itself, make it even deeper and more dense. So while it does seem like they're going to be doing more underground Hyrule, I also think there's a lot more room for growth above Hyrule as well. So maybe there could be more going on in the sky, perhaps different areas, maybe Sky Town, and maybe even more enemies that we could see in the sky. Maybe not just having the peaceful god dragons, but also some evil dark ones that we can actually fight as well. That'll be very exciting to see, and also terrifying at the same time. Considering how scary it was the first time I saw Naydra, and that was actually not an enemy, I can only think how terrifying it would be to fight dragons of similar size that wanted to kill me. That would be scary, but also something that I think would make the game really cool. Now, while it will be very exciting to see even more overall boss designs, I also think there should be more dungeon boss designs as well. In Breath of the Wild, there weren't too many. You basically had the different scourges of Calamity Ganon, and then Calamity Ganon, and that was it until you got the DLC, and that was just a monk. It would be really nice to see more bosses along the lines of what we saw, for example, in Twilight Princess, or Ocarina of Time, or Skyward Sword. There was more boss variety there, and I want that to return in the sequel. Now, these bosses I'm referring to were in classical style dungeons, and in Breath of the Wild, we did not see that. Those types of dungeons were for the most part gone, or just not in high number. What we got were the Divine Beasts, which were sort of like previous dungeons, but not quite. I do think it's still really likely that we're going to get a number of mini dungeon challenges, just kind of like with the shrines in this game, although I don't think they're going to be shrines or Sheikah Towers, because those were completely vacant from what we saw of Hyrule at the end of the trailer, so it seems like the Sheikah technology has receded back underground, so maybe there will be more of an emphasis of exploring underground. But the point is, there won't be Sheikah technology, but I still think there'll be some sort of mini challenges thrown all throughout the world. But what I really think is going to be brought back this time around are classical style dungeons. Why? Well, that's because it's another common criticism for Breath of the Wild, a lack of classical style dungeons. Like I said, I still think there's room for the open world format and the mini style dungeons like the shrines and all of that, but if that were all to be supported by a number of classical style dungeons in the game, I think that would make things very, very interesting. It'll be really cool to see how the Zelda team will handle classical style dungeons in the open world format for Breath of the Wild. There is a huge amount of potential here, and in terms of understanding where they could appear since we are returning to Hyrule, keep in mind that this Hyrule is the oldest Hyrule we've ever had before, and there is so much underground, as hinted at in the sequel trailer, so maybe a lot of these classical style dungeons will be underground. When you take into consideration that the DLC had a dungeon underground on the Great Plateau, that Yiga have this big giant hole that leads to the depths of Hyrule, and also that we have the Forgotten Temple and a very low part of Hyrule, I think there's definitely a lot of evidence to suggest that the classical style dungeons that we've seen in previous Zelda games are still somewhere in the map of Hyrule. Take into consideration that the entire map of Hyrule in Breath of the Wild has all sorts of nods or markings or descriptions for different Zelda locales all throughout the history of the series, but what's been mysteriously missing from the entire map this time are the different classical style dungeons we've seen throughout the entire history of Zelda. Where are they? Well, as I've been talking about, my theory is that most of them are underground, and with the rise of Calamity Ganondorf, or whatever he's going to be called this time around, I do think a lot of these dungeons will be unearthed, or Zelda and Link will be forced to explore them to find a way to beat him this time around. Regardless of how they actually end up incorporating classical style dungeons into Breath of the Wild 2, I do think there's a strong demand for it, and for that reason alone, there's a really good chance they will be returning in the sequel. Moving on to the other criticism I was referring to earlier in the video, I think the story in Breath of the Wild 2 will be greatly improved upon compared to the original Breath of the Wild. You see, with Breath of the Wild 1, you could explore and progress through the game however you so choose. But the drawback of that is that they were not able to tell a story in a traditional way compared to previous Zeldas, so I think usually a linear story is the best way to go about doing things, and they didn't quite do that with Breath of the Wild 1. They had more of a Pulp Fiction style of telling the story, which I think is very interesting, but it wasn't quite like Pulp Fiction because it was all flashbacks, but you would get them at different points throughout the game depending on where you chose to explore and find these memories. But here's the thing, all of these memories were optional. They weren't mandatory for understanding the overall story here. There wasn't like this big character arc where there was twists and turns all throughout. None of that was really there. But there were these really compelling characters, the champions and of course Zelda, but most of their stories were told in the past. And most of those characters are already dead when you're playing the original Breath of the Wild. So that left a lot to be desired. As we discussed with one of the rumors, Nintendo's gonna have to find a way, perhaps like the rumor suggests, to incorporate a linear story to some extent as we explore this open world game. Maybe it is that the game is sort of linear at first and it opens up little by little. That is one way to go about it. But either way, with the second go around, I think Nintendo will go at it with a little bit more perspective and give us a better told story than Breath of the Wild 1. In my opinion, the best told story in the entire Zelda series is Skyward Sword, and the story could be told along those lines with different character arcs all throughout our campaign from beginning to end, while still maintaining that open world format we got for Breath of the Wild. I think that could be the perfect balance, and I am definitely thinking that Nintendo will find a way to do that this time. I find it kind of funny, but I actually have even more criticisms for Breath of the Wild, or rather, things that I think can be improved upon for the game. I know, I've been talking about all these criticisms of Breath of the Wild, even though I love it so much, but it's just that there is so much potential out there to make an even better game. So we know we're returning to Hyrule again this time around, meaning that in order to make things interesting, they're going to have to add a lot more to the world and change things around in order for it to make sense for us to play through Hyrule again. With Breath of the Wild 1, the story was that it's a post-apocalyptic Hyrule, meaning that all of the civilization that used to be there was no more. But with the sequel, as the end for the original Breath of the Wild suggests, there's going to be a focus on restoring Hyrule, and a lot more people are going to be coming back and rebuilding these towns. So what that may lead to is a far denser Hyrule with more people and characters and side quests and things to do. And I definitely loved some of the side quests in Breath of the Wild, but some of them also left a lot to be desired. I'm hoping that the side quests will be more along the lines of what we got with the Terrytown quest, where we got to meet these actual characters and learn about them, and they had their own character arcs, and we actually rebuilt the town. It would be interesting if they took that idea and took it a whole other level with rebuilding these different towns and villages all throughout the world of Hyrule in Breath of the Wild 2. The main point I'm trying to make here is that in this version of Hyrule in Breath of the Wild 2, they're going to be making it far more dense with characters and things to do than the original. So far from Breath of the Wild 2, we've talked about how they can improve upon the battle system and the weapon durability system, but also how they could bring in more character and enemy designs, including boss designs, but on top of that, bringing in classical style dungeons mixed into the open world format of Breath of the Wild, and while still maintaining that open air environment and gameplay, they will find a way to incorporate an even better told story than the original Breath of the Wild. And given that we are returning to Hyrule this time around, they're going to make the world even denser than before, and not have it as vacant as the original, giving us a lot more to do in terms of interacting with the world, the characters, and side quests. With all of these different things, I think Breath of the Wild 2 will be a far more richer world, and Nintendo will have found a way to master the open air style for Zelda games. And Breath of the Wild was already in conversation for one of the greatest games ever made. Improving upon it in all of these different ways could definitely make Breath of the Wild 2 that much closer to being one of the greatest games ever made, if not the greatest game ever made. But I have one more thing that I want to be better or improved upon in the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. So you see, something that's really exciting me about Breath of the Wild 2 is that it seems like this time around, the antagonist is going to be far more compelling. Before, the antagonistic force was Calamity Ganon, but Calamity Ganon sort of gave up its personality and was more of a force of nature. And while that was definitely a cool thing to see, there's something about having an actual antagonistic force that you have a relationship with in games that raises the stakes and makes things more interesting, especially considering that if Calamity Ganon, the entire antagonistic force we fought in Breath of the Wild, was simply the wisps or energy vacating the body or the corpse of Ganondorf deep underground, accumulating over years, how much stronger and devastating and terrifying would be the actual source of all of this malice? Ganondorf could be far worse than the Calamity Ganon, and I think that could be very exciting, and seeing some sort of rivalry or antagonism from Ganondorf between Link and Zelda could be very exciting to see, especially if it builds over the course of Breath of the Wild 2 with the story. I think that can make things very satisfying, especially if the final boss fight is as satisfying as some of the best boss fights we've seen in previous Zelda games. In my opinion, two of the best final boss fights in Zelda history are the one for Ocarina of Time and the Wind Waker. I do not think the final boss fight in Breath of the Wild was that great, and yes, for my games, I love a final climactic clash to end it all. You can make the argument that the Ganon thing we fought inside Hyrule Castle was that fight, but there was another fight beyond that, and it was more of a easy victory lap around this giant purple pig that didn't really move much. It was sort of an insult to how much they had built up this evil force. I want something that's going to give me a challenge to the very end, and I think like Ocarina of Time or Twilight Princess or the Wind Waker, there needs to be multiple phases to taking down Ganondorf, because he is that powerful and he is that important, and I think that will help to lead to a very, very satisfying ending to what I think could be the greatest game of all time. It has that chance to do that. Will Nintendo actually get this done? Maybe, and of course, this is all subjective. What may be great for one person won't be as great for another. Not everyone loves Breath of the Wild as much as I do, or some of you watching, of course. But still, I think Breath of the Wild 2 could very well become a massive improvement over Breath of the Wild 1, which in my opinion is already a masterpiece. And the idea of that is incredibly exciting. So hopefully we get to see Breath of the Wild 2 sometime this year, at least a teaser trailer for it. That would be exhilarating, of course. But let me know what you guys think of the possibility and potential of Breath of the Wild 2. I'm really curious what you guys have to say. Anyways, everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care.